James Archibald Hope's The Military Memoirs of an Infantry Officer offers a vivid account of his experiences in the British Army during the Napoleonic Wars. Hope shares insights into battles, soldier life, and the camaraderie of the infantry, providing a first-hand glimpse into the challenges and resilience of military service. These are his words. Let's begin. In the beginning of the summer of 1809, the whole European Commonwealth, Austria, Spain, Portugal and Sicily excepted, was arrayed in arms against the British Isles. Before the autumnal sun had cheered the heart of the Austrian husbandman, that powerful empire, after a series of sanguinary conflicts, was compelled to sue for peace and join the ranks of the enemy. This unfortunate event reduced the number of our allies from 40 to 16 million, consequently giving our haughty antagonist a numerical superiority of 114 million. France and her allies formed a body of 150 million, while Britain and her small band of faithful friends amounted to 36 million souls only. Such was the unequal division of power in Europe in July 1809, when the grand expedition, under the present Earl of Chatham, departed from British shores to assail the enemy in a quarter then seen as the most vulnerable point of his widely extended dominions. During this period of preparation, the eyes of every inhabitant of these realms were fixed on the place of rendezvous. With breathless anxiety, they watched every ship and battalion as if the fate, not only of the United Kingdom but of the civilized world, depended on the forthcoming assault. From Land's End to John O'Groats, and from Donegady to the southernmost promontory of Erin's Green Isle, the interest excited on this occasion was universally the same. Throughout Scotland, England and Ireland, in both the mansion of the peer and the lowly abode of the peasant, only one prayer was heard. It was for the success of the expedition, wherever bound, and a safe return for those embarked. At Deal, Ramsgate and Portsmouth, daily scenes of a most animated description unfolded to any spectator, from the commencement of preparations until the last vessel spread her white sails to the wind and bade farewell to the chalky cliffs of the sea-girt isle. Throughout this interesting period, the embarkation of men, horses, artillery and military stores continued without intermission, until all the ships in the fleet were filled with the munitions of war and the gallant spirits destined to apply them to deadly purposes. The sight of some battalions' embarkations was heart-rending. Watching the poor women take leave of their husbands, many to meet no more, was agonizing. The cries, the piteous lamentations, and the tears streaming down their careworn cheeks were enough to penetrate even the hardest heart. The soldiers' feelings were equally honourable. Those witnessing the touching scenes saw that while soldiers may live in danger and face the horror of battle, they possess far more of the finer human emotions than most give them credit for. The parting words, such as, "God bless you, Mary, be kind to our babes," or "Farewell, Betsy, think of me till I return," were often heard as they grasped their partners' hands, bidding them farewell. These requests were invariably followed by promises and sealed with tender embraces. Scenes of dissipation were also numerous, particularly in Portsmouth, where it wasn't uncommon to see a sailor locked in the arms of a companion on the beach. Often, considerable exertion was needed to rouse them from their slumber and persuade them to leave their public couch for a more secluded place. For 2 weeks before the expedition set sail, Deal was filled to overflowing with naval and military officers of all ranks. Every hotel, tavern, and many private houses were so crowded that one evening 4 of my friends had to pay £1 4 shillings for a room with a single bed. The people of Deal, determined to reap a golden harvest, charged exorbitant prices for nearly every item required, which unfortunately were paid without much grumbling by the thoughtless crowd of purchasers. The principal shops were packed, particularly confectionery establishments, where the sparkling eyes of the fair shopkeepers proved too tempting for many. Speaking of which, why do so many confectioners and fancy snuff retailers place pretty little creatures behind their counters? I condemn this practice as one of pernicious tendency, as it presents an immoral temptation for the giddy and thoughtless. As this is an undeniable fact, respectable tradesmen should stand fair with the world and their consciences. Those employing such decoy ducks should abandon this practice. They can be sure no honourable man will patronize such barefaced attempts to attract customers. From sunrise to sunset, Deal and its environs daily presented a singular and interesting picture. Afloat and ashore, morning guns and reveille disturbed nocturnal rest and roused thousands into action. By dawn, life and gaiety filled the air. Boats packed with naval and military heroes skimmed across the sea towards the landing place. Foraging parties returned to their ships with provisions, while others remained on shore to enjoy the day's pleasures. By noon, more boats approached the beach, unloading fresh waves of men. While these arrivals annoyed most, shopkeepers and publicans thrived. Once ashore, officers pursued their individual pleasures. The politician found newspapers, the prudent focused on personal comfort, while the youthful tormented billiard markers or charmed shopgirls. Time eventually pointed to the hour of 4, signalling them to enjoy Deal's hospitality or return to their ships for the evening's feast. From then, every hotel and place of public resort was filled with warriors, drinking and singing, "How merrily we live who soldiers be." When the surf ran high at the landing place, these tipsy mortals often entertained their more sober comrades. Having drunk more than they should, they struggled to get into their skiffs, often bruising their legs and taking a dunking in the water before finally achieving their aim. Never before had such a unique mass of humanity been gathered in such a small space. Deal was filled with men from every country, of every religious persuasion, and every profession under the sun. The variety of costumes worn and languages spoken made it feel as if a second Babel was being built on the heights between Deal and Dover. The day eventually arrived when all had to set aside revelry and prepare for battle. On July 27th, the ominous signal, Blue Peter, was hoisted on the headquarters ship. Though nothing had indicated the exact point of debarkation, it soon became clear that Holland was our destination. This discovery was unwelcome, given the harsh memories of the campaigns of 1794 and 1795. Those recollections, along with disastrous news from the Danube, cast a shadow over both services. However, a more unpleasant sensation was the appointment of a titled general to lead the expedition. Rumours had circulated for some time, but it wasn't believed until it appeared in the London Gazette. Many other generals were qualified for this command, having spent their lives in foreign service and deserving such an appointment. There was widespread belief that some of the best and bravest were neglected. Rumour even suggested promises had been made that would have kept the noble Earl at home, leaving him to live in hope. If the troops had chosen the commander-in-chief, no doubt they would have selected the general whose talents shone in Spain after the fall of his friend, the lamented Moore. I witnessed a private soldier of the 36th Regiment refuse to embark at Portsmouth. When asked why, he coolly replied it was because Sir John Hope wasn't in command. He was forced into the boat, but as he departed he shouted, "Sir John Hope forever," to which the crowd on shore cheered. When the signal to sail was raised, many officers were still ashore, and if the fleet had left immediately, some would have been left behind. Many only made it back to their ships by 4 in the morning, paying exorbitant fees for a short trip. The troops in this expedition consisted of 12 squadrons of cavalry, 40 battalions of infantry, and 80 to 100 pieces of artillery, formed into 16 brigades and 7 divisions. The naval part of the expedition consisted of between 300 and 400 vessels of all denominations, upwards of 100 of which were ships of the line, frigates, sloops, brigs of war, etc. The entire fleet was placed under the command of Rear Admiral Sir Richard Strachan, with Rear Admiral Sir R.G. Keats as his second on this important occasion. At daybreak on the 28th of July, all hands were called to the deck to assist at the capstan, and every man, soldiers and sailors alike, cheerfully joined in the old British cry of "Yo, heave-ho!" In less than an hour, a large portion of the fleet had unfurled their white sails to the wind and were ploughing their way toward the Scheldt, their decks covered with thousands of warriors, who, as they cast long and lingering looks behind, sang, "Ye beauteous maids your smiles bestow, for if ye prove unkind, how can we hope to beat the foe who leave our hearts behind?" The vessels of war moved outside the transports, and the gunboats, with the assistance of buoys, marked the route for the whole fleet. The appearance of the fleet that morning was even more magnificent than when it had been at anchor in the Downs. Nothing could be more awe-inspiring than the sight of the largest class of our men of war cutting through the foaming billows, leading the way to the scene of action. For hours I paced the deck of our little brig, admiring with national pride the noble and unrivalled spectacle before me. After my eyes had been sufficiently feasted, I descended into our small cabin and prayed to the giver of victory for success, commensurate with the magnitude of the armament. Upon weighing anchor, the wind was favourable, blowing what our nautical friends called a gentle breeze. But as we receded from the British shore, it freshened, and for the rest of the day it blew hard. A few hours after leaving our anchorage, and once some order had been restored on deck, we retired to the cabin for our morning meal. However, the servants had neglected to secure the table to the cabin floor, and within minutes one sudden lurch of our little ship sent everything flying. In an instant, away went seats and sitters, table, teapot, cups, bread, butter and eggs, all toward the ample figure of our worthy quartermaster, a man nearly 6 feet 4 inches tall. No sooner did he feel himself starting to slide backwards than, like a drowning man grasping at a straw, he grabbed hold of the table, which, just as ready for some fun, happily accompanied him in his descent to the lower part of the cabin. Failing to preserve his position, the quartermaster could only let the matter take its course, and down went his head while his heels flew up. In a moment he was lying, not in his blood, but in tea, nearly suffocated by the caresses of his friends, who, in their journey to the same part of the cabin, had found the quartermaster an unavoidable obstacle. The wind had increased significantly during the night of the 28th, and by daybreak on the 29th, the sailors called it a stiff gale. 2 hours after sunrise, the sea presented an unusual sight, as vessels at the rear appeared to be descending a considerable slope. As the day progressed, the wind intensified, and the surrounding waters became so turbulent that when the masters of transports were moving between their ships and their respective commodores, they frequently seemed to be on the verge of being engulfed by the roaring waves. The smaller craft pitched and rolled fearfully, while the crews of the gunboats had their hands full. The decks of the latter, raised only slightly above the water, were regularly swept by waves, thoroughly drenching the crew. By nightfall, the poor sailors resembled more an amphibious species than human beings. The cries for help from some of the men were truly heart-wrenching. Before the expedition left the Downs, there had been fierce competition among junior naval officers for command of the gunboats, with each candidate calling upon all the influence they could muster to secure the post. But I am quite certain that, if honour had allowed, many of these spirited officers would have gladly used the same influence to return to their former positions. At around 9 o'clock on the morning of the 29th, the lookout spotted the Dutch coast ahead, and by noon many vessels had dropped anchor in the Roompot, but later moved to safer anchorage in the Veerregat, between the islands of Shawen and North Beveland. The entire fleet reassembled here by the evening and into the next day. With everything ready for an immediate descent on the enemy's coast, part of the army destined to attack Flushing was moved into flat-bottomed boats. At 4 o'clock in the afternoon of the 30th, they moved off in beautiful order towards the shore. Under the cover of bomb vessels and gun brigs, the smaller craft advanced in great regularity until, just before reaching the landing place, a general cry of "Devil take the hindmost!" rang out from right to left. Landing troops in the face of an enemy is always a hazardous operation, and considerable anxiety was visible on every face until those who had gone ahead had secured a foothold on the enemy's soil. After landing on the island of Walcheren, at a place called the Brisand, about a mile from Fort de Hack, part of General Fraser's troops advanced against the fort. When the enemy evacuated it upon his approach, General Fraser continued his offensive towards Terveer. The governor of this fortress was unwilling to surrender, so the place was besieged from the land and bombarded from the river throughout the night of the 30th and all of the 31st. These actions led the commandant to negotiate, and eventually the town, garrison, and military stores were surrendered the following day. Middelburg, the capital of this small island, surrendered to Sir Eyre Coote on the 31st of July, and Fort Rammekens followed on the 3rd of August, after a formal investment, and as our batteries were about to open on its defences. While these operations were ongoing, a portion of the fleet under Sir Richard Keats, carrying the reserve commanded by Sir John Hope, sailed up the eastern branch of the Scheldt. On the 1st of August, they landed on the island of South Beveland, which fell into our hands that day and the next. General Disney's brigade of guards was sent toward Fort Batts, a stronghold at the island's upper end, which the enemy evacuated, allowing the guards to occupy it on the 3rd of August. The Earl of Dalhousie's brigade supported this movement, while Sir William Erskine's brigade took Tergoes, the island's main town, along with nearby villages. A few days later, this brigade advanced 6 or 7 miles further, capturing the towns of Capelle, Bieselinge, and others. After considerable fighting between the troops under Generals Graham, Houston, and Lord Paget and the enemy, Flushing was tightly besieged on the 1st of August. From that day forward, our comrades' duties during the siege were unrelenting. Due to the dampness of the soil and heavy daily rains, their tasks were both severe and dangerous. Constructing batteries and carrying out other field operations, the British troops faced constant challenges from the hostile weather and an active, enterprising enemy. Yet every man bore his share of hardships and dangers with such firmness and resolution that they earned the admiration and gratitude of their superiors. Honour, country, liberty, terms unknown to the military slave or mercenary, were enough to carry the British soldier through every trial. For such causes, he would gladly lay down his life, believing that by doing so he would preserve the liberties and honour of his homeland for future generations. From the 1st of August onward, daily skirmishes took place between the besieged and the besiegers. The French commandant, determined to slow the progress of his opponents, let no opportunity pass. His salvos of artillery from the ramparts and his well-planned sorties caused delays and many casualties. Yet despite his efforts, our batteries were ready to open fire by the 12th of August. As every moment was precious, preparations for a combined land and sea attack on Flushing were made for the following morning. At 10 o'clock, our land batteries opened fire and were gallantly supported by several of our warships. However, the ships' fire proved less effective than expected, prompting Sir Richard Strachan to withdraw them, intending to try again the next day. On the morning of the 14th of August, Sir Richard Strachan once again weighed anchor, positioning 6 or 8 ships of the line close to the enemy's batteries, and immediately opened fire on the town. Rapid, dreadful broadsides from his ships, combined with shore batteries, soon set fire to several parts of Flushing. For some hours, General Monet responded with vigour, returning fire with much effect. But by 4 o'clock, flames had spread throughout the town, and so many of his guns had been disabled that by 5 o'clock his fire had nearly ceased. Sir Eyre Coote then sent a flag of truce to the governor, giving him 1 hour to consider surrender terms. When no reply arrived after the hour expired, the cannonade resumed and continued until almost the entire town was in flames. Convinced that further resistance would only cost more lives, General Monet offered to capitulate, requesting that he and his troops be sent to France. When this was refused, he accepted the British commander's terms: surrender of all troops, as prisoners of war, along with all artillery and military stores. The enemy's total loss amounted to 6,079 men, 224 pieces of artillery, 2,000 barrels of gunpowder, and an immense quantity of military supplies. The sound of artillery in and around Flushing quickly reached the people in South Beverland, where I was stationed. Soon the roofs of churches and windmills were crowded with anxious spectators, many of whom had friends or relatives in Flushing. Although we were far from the embattled fortress, the spectacle of the conflict unfolded before us in a grand yet melancholic form. Only those close to the action could truly understand the horrors that followed the last cannonade. Even at our distance, the sight was so appalling that though we had long desired Flushing's fall, we could not help but shed tears for the innocent inhabitants. Surrounded by flames and under the constant threat of death from shot and shell, they had endured a day and night of unspeakable horror. By daybreak on the 15th, Flushing resembled a vast charnel house. Wherever one looked, the town was filled with houses tottering in ruins, as the flames had left them black and bare. Half-burnt bodies littered the streets, attracting wolves and ravens, and tempting the houseless dogs to feast. Having long anticipated that the fall of Flushing would signal the advance of both army and navy to pursue further operations against the enemy, the disappointment was indescribable when, instead of being ordered to continue the fight, the entire army was left to languish in cantonments. This inglorious idleness lasted so long that the troops became sickly, raising doubts about the wisdom of any further military action against Antwerp. A council of war was eventually held, but not until 10 days after the surrender of Flushing. The council's deliberations were kept secret, but rumours circulated. One claimed that a naval officer had offered, with a certain number of frigates, to lead an attack on Antwerp, to burn or destroy the enemy's fleet and stores if supported by Sir John Hope and 22,000 men. Although this offer was not accepted, it indicated that one of the council's members felt he was not being allowed to contribute as much as his talents entitled him to. The same day, there were reports that some general officers had expressed a desire to return to England rather than continue blocking this officer's appointment to command in Holland. Whether these reports were true or not, the overall atmosphere was one of frustration and confusion. Around the 20th of August, the troops were first struck by fever and ague. By the end of the month, the disease had spread through every battalion, though some suffered more severely than others. Many soldiers were quartered in barns, and often 6 or 8 men in the same barn would be struck down with illness in a single night. This was unsurprising, given the natural dampness of the barn floors and the humidity of the Dutch climate, both of which were enough to cause disease even in more elevated locations. As a remedy for the pestilential vapours, mass bathing was recommended by the medical staff. Soldiers were marched to the right bank of the Western Scheldt around midday. At the sound of a bugle, the men undressed, but none dared enter the water until a second bugle gave them permission to do so, wearing nothing but the covering provided by Adam. The ensuing scene could only be captured by an artist like Cruikshank. Mere words could not do it justice. While some found it amusing, I was filled with disgust. I concede that many soldiers are not particularly refined, but even in a mixed group, there are those whose sensibilities must have been deeply wounded by this novel and indecent display. It is bad policy to place men in situations where any change in their behaviour is likely to be for the worse. Sir William Erskine, who was familiar with the nature of the malady, recommended a different treatment: 1 glass of brandy before dressing, 1 at breakfast, 1 after dinner, and 1 in the evening. This remedy, more in line with the habits and tastes of the brigade, quickly elevated Sir William's reputation as a son of Aesculapius, above others with greater medical pretensions. Despite these antidotes, death began to claim lives towards the end of August. As fatalities increased, it was decided to send all the sick back to England on the 1st of September. On the 2nd, our division, the reserve, was notified to prepare for embarkation. The following morning we marched to the left bank of the eastern Scheldt, boarded the waiting transports, and dropped down to the anchorage at the Veergat. However, due to some unexplainable delay, we were detained for nearly a week, breathing in the infection with every breath, when we could have been enjoying the healthy breezes of our homeland. As a result, fever and ague spread rapidly, and before we reached England, more than half the men were under medical treatment, and the rest were as uncomfortable as our worst enemy could wish. On the morning after we re-embarked, between 20 and 30 men on my transport fell ill. The worst cases were moved from the hold into boats on deck under an awning to prevent the disease from spreading. In one of these makeshift hospitals, 10 or 12 soldiers were confined on the evening of the 5th of September, when the first death occurred: a tall, handsome grenadier who passed away. His comrades, convinced their own end was near, became so agitated that they had to be forced to remain in their berths. I was on deck when the grenadier died, and seeing the distress his death caused, I tried to comfort the others and dispel their fears. But the prospect of death weighed too heavily on them, and nothing I said had any effect. One of the men, a tall and robust non-commissioned officer, suddenly leaped to his feet, ran along the deck in a state of temporary madness, crying that he was dying. He only returned to his place after a fresh attack of ague left him no choice. Among the group was a grenadier named Willie Mill, a man of great physical strength but weak intellect. When the sergeant leaped from the boat, Willie attempted to follow but was stopped by the sentry. The next morning I expected to find Willie near death, but instead I found him asking the pay sergeant for breakfast. Willie, always having a keen appetite, pressed his case so strongly that the sergeant almost gave in. However, duty prevailed, and Willie's request was refused. Undeterred, Willie turned to the sergeant and said, "Well, if you think those things are too strong for my weak stomach, just tell the cook to make me some porridge and make it thick." His request drew laughter from the deck, and even his sick companions joined in. Willie's second appeal proved irresistible. He got his meal, recovered, and, as far as I know, still enjoys his daily portion of porridge. On the 8th of September, the transports carrying our regiment left the Dutch coast, and on the 10th we anchored in the Downs. The following morning we set sail for Harwich, but due to unfavourable winds, we didn't arrive until the afternoon of the 13th. Early on the 14th, the worst cases were sent to the care of the medical staff at Harwich, while a few who could be safely moved were taken by boat to Ipswich. In the afternoon, the rest of the battalion, including the remaining sick, landed at Landguard Fort and marched to Woodbridge Barracks, the healthy on foot, the sick in wagons. The sight of the sick being moved from the transports to the shore and then to Woodbridge was heartbreaking. Their emaciated figures and pale faces, the shrieks and groans caused by the jolting wagons, brought tears to my eyes. Yet as distressing as this scene was, it was soon eclipsed by even more sorrowful ones. For weeks after our arrival at Woodbridge, the sick list grew daily, until more than 400 men were confined in the hospital. 2, 3, and even 4 men were often buried in one day, laid to rest by the few who had been spared by a merciful providence. At first, the dead were buried with military honours, but this practice was abandoned when the medical staff informed the commanding officer that the sound of the muffled drum had such a powerful effect on the sick that it renewed symptoms previously subdued by medicine. As each funeral procession crossed the barrack square, the lamentations of friends and the wails of widows and orphans pierced every ear and heart. These distressing scenes, the result of mismanagement and rashness, will never fade from my memory. During the first 2 months of our time at Woodbridge, the duties of the regimental medical staff were unrelenting, particularly for Assistant Surgeon Dunn, whose compassion never allowed him to leave the bedside of the sick while his medical help could still be of use. The soldiers blessed him at every turn, encouraging him to continue his diligent and humane service. I mention this to show my young medical friends that only through such humane, diligent and faithful work can they hope to earn the gratitude and respect of those in their care. Regarding the losses we sustained in this disastrous expedition, I note that the battalion's effective strength, which had been 998 men upon landing in South Beverland, had been so reduced by the pestilence that by October only between 200 and 300 men were fit for duty. One morning, the Grenadier Company could muster only 2 non-commissioned officers and 3 privates for parade. But deaths, however numerous, were not the only loss we suffered. The disease had left such a mark on the survivors' constitutions that when tested later in the peninsula, they were no longer the same men. Their bodies had become so weakened that exposure to the night air or a heavy shower would send many of them back to bed and then to the hospital, where they often suffered until they passed away. Given our condition in Woodbridge, it's no surprise that the months of October and November seemed long and cheerless. But for the Jubilee Parade, subscription ball, and dinner on the 25th of October, we might have succumbed to ennui. That afternoon, the garrison, 4 battalions of infantry, a body of artillery, and some German cavalry, were marshalled in the barrack square by Baron Alten. Almost immediately after the troops took their positions, the thundering of cannon, volleys of musketry, and the cheers of the soldiers echoed by crowds proclaimed that George III, the father of his people, had completed the 50th year of his reign. After the pageant, the officers made their way to Woodbridge, where they sat down at 5 o'clock to an elegant dinner with every delicacy the season offered. Nearly every officer in the garrison attended, and for some time all went well. However, on such occasions, the inexperienced often allow reason to give way to folly, and they are led into extravagance. Youth and inexperience may excuse some actions, but certain offences cannot be pardoned, even for the young. I hope the younger officers will heed the advice of their more experienced colleagues and avoid following a tutor from the school of folly. By doing so, they will sail through life as smoothly as a small boat on calm waters, and like that boat, reach the harbour without encountering anything that would diminish the pleasure of life's voyage. On the 6th of March 1810, I left Woodbridge and headed to Scotland on my way to join the 2nd Battalion of my regiment in Ireland. Being in poor health, I spent a few weeks in Edinburgh before heading to the countryside to breathe the fresh air of my native hills. That concludes the first part of the story. Thank you very much for listening. Please subscribe for more episodes and leave a comment.